Hi, this is David Thornburg, President and CEO of the Committee of 70. Welcome to another edition of Studio C70, which is our communications platform to talk to important folks locally and around the country about how we can strengthen our local democracy. We're really pleased today to be joined by Al Schmidt, City Commissioner, Vice Chair of the City Commissioners. Welcome, Al.
No, thanks for having me on. I've watched a number of these and really think they're terrific.
Well, great. Glad we could grab some of your time. I know we got a little break in the action, not much after the primary, which we'll talk a lot more about. But Al, just in the way of introduction, brief introduction, is in his third term as City Commissioner. He is a graduate of Allegheny College out west. He and I share roots as Western Pennsylvanians, and also has a PhD from Brandeis. And before he came to the City Commissioners, had spent some time at the General Accountability Office and came to Philadelphia in the early 2000s. I gather, Al, to follow the woman that is now your wife.
That's right.
So that's great. But we want to jump right in, and I guess the first and most obvious question is to focus on the primary election on June 2nd. And I'm going to push you a little bit. The general question is, how did things go? But if to push you a little further, how would you grade the performance of the city commissioners on an ABC scale?
So considering the challenges, the election went pretty well. We had new election laws that came into effect pretty immediately before the primary. We had a new voting system with voting by mail. We had relatively new voting machines that a lot of voters would have used for the first time that we rolled out in the general election of last year. We had the COVID situation that caused us to lose most of our polling places and many of our election board workers. So we had to run a mail-in election and an in-person election, and the in-person election with losing all of our senior centers, with losing all of our firehouses, and a lot of other locations and a lot of consolidation. We also had, civil unrest immediately leading up to and including election day in some places. So those are not things election administrators normally plan for, especially in a hurry. The law, Act 77 had some reforms that came along the way. So we're sort of hitting a moving target and figuring out how to make sure to staff all these election boards, how to make sure that we provide PPE to those election boards and workers to make sure that people can vote safely on election day. So it's a presidential primary. Turnout was pretty high. So normally when turnout is higher, you have more problems, right? You have more voters, and in this case, more voters going to fewer locations. You had a new voting system, like I mentioned. So grading on a curve, I think I went pretty well. Doesn't mean there weren't bumps. It was certainly bumpy.
But I have to go back to my question. Give us a grade, even grading on a curve.
Well, I mean, I used to teach, so grade.
I would have to know whether you're a tough grader or a walkover. But
unfortunately, I was a pretty tough grader. But and I taught political history, so reviewing the past and assessing it should come pretty easily. But I also know that you can't grade your own paper. So you would probably be in a better position to evaluate it than I would. But all in, I think it went very well.
Okay, I'll let you off the hook. Let me approach the related question, put you in this role. You did spend time as a senior analyst at the General Accountability Office. I think you mentioned to me at one point that you'd actually looked into the workings of the post office in that job. And obviously the post office looms large in this mail voting environment. But if you were a GIO analyst still, and you were looking at the experience of this June 2nd primary, what would you identify as maybe the top 3 areas for improvement?
That is a great way to look at it. And the advantage to working at GAO is not only working with a terrific group of people who are very dedicated to efficient and effective government and delivery of public services, but the advantage to GAO is you never actually have to do it. You just have to say what didn't go well. And in our case, you got to say what didn't go well and you got to implement it.
Yeah.
You have to come up with recommendations, findings, lessons learned, and then carry them out. One would be, you know, a lot of cities and states have had the ability to kind of ease into mail-in voting. In this last election, about half of all votes that were cast by mail. We had 225,000 people apply. We had 175,000 people vote by mail, and about 175,000 people vote in person. So what you really do is running two completely separate elections at the same time. Voting by mail helps alleviate the rush on election day, which is very good, especially under these circumstances. But one would be making sure that if you don't have it, you get the technology in place and the personnel ramped up that you need to process an absolute avalanche of mail-in ballots, because there was no easing into this thing.
Right.
Very abrupt.
Yeah.
We got slammed with applications. And thanks to the rest of the city government, about a half a dozen or more other city agencies sent personnel over to assist us. Managing director's office was helpful, controller's office, DA's office, the library of Philadelphia sent over clerks. We had a whole army of people working on this to make sure that we could get every application processed before the deadline, and we were able to do that, unlike a number of other counties. That's not schadenfreude, but it's, you know, we know the challenges that they faced.
So recommendation one, again, back if you were in your GAO days, is we have to up our game in terms of the equipment that we have to work with. And you also mentioned staffing. What else would be on that top 3 list?
I think there are also lessons learned from polling place consolidation. We were more or less reduced to using locations that we had complete control of, which were libraries and schools. The libraries were closed, the schools were closed. We could have access to them in advance to set up in those places, to drop off personal protective equipment in those places, to arrange the terrific number of tables and voting machines that you'd have, where instead of having 1 or 2 divisions or precincts, you have 10 or more in one location. With a little more time, you can be more thoughtful in considering, hey, is that library the best place to have it? Is there another place nearby that you can find that would give you more space or give voters more kind of convenience in voting? So I think there are lessons learned from that as well. But a lot of those things require resources when it comes to technology and personnel, and time when it comes to exploring a city of our size to find polling places that are wheelchair accessible and ADA compliant, and rooms where you can provide distance between election board workers and one another, and election board workers and voters and one another, and voting at enough space with voting machines. Yes. So a little more time definitely helps with that as well.
Yep. All right. So, you know, you and I were talking, I know your colleagues on the city commissioners, Lisa Dealey and Omar Sabir, are actually out in Denver on a mission to maybe a benchmarking trip to try to understand what it is that Denver gets right, maybe some things that Philadelphia does better. But I did see on Twitter this morning, I don't know if you saw this, you know, Denver just had a primary, I think, on Tuesday, and barely a whimper in terms of all the concern that we've seen after the Wisconsin primaries and the Georgia primaries. So let's hope that collectively, the three of you can get your heads together and try to put a little of that Denver magic to work. But that leads me to another question.
And Denver has had the experience of doing mail-in voting for some time to work their way through the different challenges and how to best address them.
No,
Just the reason
absolutely.
why they're there is to learn from other people's experiences and successes and failures, and bring them back here for us to consider.
Yep. Well, before we go too further, I do want to publicly acknowledge, which I've said to you, I hope you heard privately, that you and your folks worked very hard in this last election. So under extraordinary circumstances, I know you were working close to 24/7, and my old student Seth Bluestein, who's your deputy, is a great asset. So I just wanted to acknowledge the effort on your part.
That's kind of you. We had a very dedicated group of people, and despite the public health concerns, we had to press on.
Yeah.
Working from home is not an option when you have to program voting machines, and it's not an option when you have to enter voter registrations and mail-in applications to a secure terminal connected to the statewide voter registration system. So we had to accommodate that by bringing in more people, and also by spacing them out and working into shifts from early morning until late at night.
Well, I also give you credit for what is in back of my head, which is deploying the Volkswagen in service to drop-off locations in the days running up to the primary. I know you remember you called me, I think on the Saturday or Sunday Memorial Day weekend, and I said, I have this crazy idea, and we're glad to help. And I think by your numbers, we were able to assist 3,500 or so voters to deposit their ballots securely into your hands. And those are votes that may not have been cast. Having said that, as you and I talked earlier, and the issue of mobile drop boxes in Philadelphia, including those powered by the Volkswagen, enabled by the Volkswagen, are the subject of a lawsuit that I guess I'm trying to remember which Republican Party, the state party or the national party, joined by 4 members of Congress, Republicans, filed the other day about the issue of drop boxes. And I'm sure you're cautious about commenting on that suit, but what were you surprised? What's your reaction? How does that forecast how you're going to think about drop boxes in the fall?
Well, before I answer your question, and I will, I want to thank you and 70 especially for your assistance with it, promoting the mobile kind of pop-up mail-in ballot drop-off locations. 70 was really helpful in getting the word out. Also, your assistance, on the ground, especially with the Volkswagen behind you, when voters were looking for us, they saw that. It's hard to miss, David.
That's what my neighbors tell me too.
So when we're in some block on South Broad Street, people spotted that before they spotted us with the tent and the tables and all of that. So I want to thank you for your help with that. With a lawsuit, like any lawsuit, I can't comment on the details of it or the merit of it or not. We always leave that up to the city solicitor's office, our lawyers in these circumstances. But I know the mobile drop-offs, like you said, allowed us to receive more than 3,500 votes, and every vote is precious, from voters where it was in that window. It was too late for them to be put in the mail to make it back to us before Election Day. And we did all that, if you recall, it seems like a long time ago, even though it was only, less than a month ago, before we knew the governor was going to extend the deadline to receive back mail-in ballots. They still had to be postmarked by Election Day, but received up to a week later, as long as they were postmarked on or before Election Day. So, we did all that not knowing that there was going to be a little bit of release valve, allowing people to mail them sort of at the last minute. We are grateful to and also at the mercy of the Postal Service when it comes to mail-in voting. We know when a ballot leaves our hands. We know when Al Schmidt applied, we know exactly when his ballot went into the mail, and I know when I received it. And in my case, which may have been unusual, this is anecdotal, but in my case, it took 9 days between when we saw my ballot go into the mail and me to receive it. And that's not even including Sunday and Memorial Day. So it was 11 days from tooth to tail between my ballot going in the mail and me getting it. Now that may be unusual, but we definitely heard that from voters. We would mail out ballots to voters and one might take 1 day and another might take a week. And while the Postal Service still expects to deliver in first-class mail in 1 to 2 days, they did come out with some statements saying, hey, because of personnel, some staffing issues and things like that, it may take longer. So we saw a real range in that. And knowing that, can give voters some concern. Are you going to be able to mail your ballot back on Thursday, which should be plenty of time to make it back by Tuesday? But in these current conditions, you don't know it as much. So being able to take your ballot and provide it directly to the Board of Elections, where the Board of Elections offices are closed to the public. So that's why the drop-offs at our Board of Elections offices and the pop-ups and the 10 locations we had on Election Day were really helpful to receive voted mail-in ballots back. But if there is a, I don't know, silver lining to the lawsuit, it's that it is happening now and it's not happening in late October, because I can't stress enough how important clarity is to anyone administering elections, because a lack of clarity inhibits our ability to communicate. When we don't know what's permitted or not permitted, when we don't know what is going to pass in Harrisburg as reforms to the reforms to the reform at the end of last year. So the sooner we get resolution on all of those things, the better. And for voters too, obviously.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk about the legislature in a second, but I'll just make the editorial comment. You don't have to agree, but that legislators don't always appreciate that fine point of clarity early is better than lack of clarity later. But back to, those things that you can control. You you are the so-called minority commissioner in this way that we have of choosing city commissioners. The other two are Democrats. You've got to figure out some way of coming together in common purpose and to agree on a common plan. And so I guess my question to you is, by what point, given what you said about clarity, do you expect to have your operational plan set as to how you want to approach the November 3rd election?
Well, we are bipartisan, and set up that way intentionally so that you have checks and balances when it comes to making decisions affecting, do you count these ballots, do you not count those ballots, or how to go about administering the election. Just like ideally every election board where you go to vote has an election board where there are, it's designed to have more than one party represented. That's not always the case, but you have a minority, judge of elections, majority inspector, minority inspector. So checks and balances are part of this, and it's important when you're kind of making decisions that affect all voters, whether they're in the majority party or one of the minority parties or independents or nonpartisans or others. Harrisburg is considering another battery of some tweaks to the election law. We're in contact with them to try to make sure that they are making informed decisions before they write the law and vote on what the law is going to be. Obviously, in touch with the courts too, to make sure that we get resolution hopefully as soon as possible with any legal challenges that we face. There are very few advantages that we'll have in the general that we didn't have in the primary. One advantage that we'll have is in the primary, the ballot isn't set until really, really late. Candidates file to get on the ballot. They challenge one another. It works its way through the courts before that ballot can be set. That ballot was only set about a month before the primary election. So while we were processing applications before that, we only were able to begin sending out mail-in ballots about a month before Election Day. With the general election, things get settled a bit earlier, hopefully mid-August. By then, third party and independent candidates will have gotten on the ballot. We'll have any ballot questions settled that will appear on the ballot, if any, for voters. And we can begin sending mail-in ballots out to voters a lot earlier. And it's a real frustration that we hear, right? I applied for my mail-in ballot in February. Everyone knows who's running for president. Why haven't I gotten my ballot yet?
Right.
And these are normal people with normal lives, right? They know as much as anyone could know, unless you're involved with the kind of nitty-gritty of election administration. So it's incomprehensible to people sometimes why that turnaround is there. So one advantage this election is we'll have that ballot settled earlier than we would, so we're be able to send out ballots earlier than we would.
Right.
We had the COVID situation unfolding in the primary. While I am certain it's not going to go away before November, hopefully we'll be able to have more polling places in the general election than we had in the primary election. Turnout is sure to increase in the general election than in the primary. Like I said, the primary election was actually pretty high for a presidential primary that was uncontested at the top of the ticket. So that's something that will be an advantage, is we won't, be flying completely blind when it comes to setting up polling places, providing PPE. Do you provide masks? Do you not provide masks? We'll know more next month than we knew,
Sure.
5 months ago.
Sure, but does that mean, and you mentioned earlier that, that you're going to look seriously, you and your fellow commissioners will look seriously at, purchasing equipment, staffing, poll worker recruitment, all of those things that take time. So does that mean you have to have your plan in place, say by Labor Day or by August 1st? Because as you pointed out, you can't turn on a dime on some of those things once you get into September or October.
And you obviously have to have the resources to do all of those things.
Right.
And we don't print money. We have a budget.
Right.
To get the resources that we need to make that happen. All those things don't hold up for the lowest or the slowest part of it to catch up.
Right.
So whether it's acquiring machines, voting machines, and seeing what some other counties did, we saw a little bit about Allegheny County and some other places that acquired other technology that helps with processing mail-in ballots. Having the number and type of those that you need is not necessarily something that has to wait. Mail-in drop-offs were really important this time because the COVID situation was obviously not expected. So, one thing, we'll have a resolution to how many drop-offs and where and when they'll be available, much further in advance than 2 weeks before Election Day, let's say. Whether there will be pop-up locations again for people to drop off ballots, whether there will be what some consider early voting locations that some other counties and states do, which is really kind of poorly phrased. It's not early voting. You wouldn't be going in and voting on a machine. It would be basically in-person mail-in voting.
Yeah, it's an odd head scratcher.
It's like using absentee when you're not absent.
I'll just say this: if I were in your shoes,
yes,
I would think I need to have that tight little plan together August 15th, subject to change, and all the whims and vagaries of what happens.
Yes. And those are based on lessons learned. Like we certified the election on time. 20 days after election day, we're one of the counties in the state that counted the votes, completed computation and certification on time. That just happened. Up until then, you know, all of our attention is focused on the last election and learning from that. And then, like you said, turning on a dime and preparing for the next election.
Yeah.
And it's not like you're not mindful of lessons learned, but your work is not focused on writing a plan for the next one when you're still wrapping up the last one.
Yeah.
And that's what we were doing up until just a few days ago.
Yeah. So you've pointed out, and I think it's important to understand, you don't operate in a vacuum. There are folks in other parts of City Hall, mayor's office, council that obviously influence what you do. And then there's the legislature and the governor in Harrisburg. So back to, I'm on to wish lists these days. What's your letter to Santa Claus in terms of what you want or what you need from some combination of the mayor's office, council, the legislature, to execute, a foolproof election in November? Like whether that's policy change, money, whatever it is, you tell us.
A few things. I mean, everyone always says more money, but it's not just that. It's like I said, clarity. We need clarity on what the laws are going to do. And we need them as quickly as possible, because we'd be putting a plan in place to implement laws that are not yet clear or decided upon. So clarity is first and foremost. And the other two components that we talked about a little bit are technology and personnel. All those applications, have to be processed by someone, an individual standing behind sitting behind a terminal, entering in a paper application. Whether it's electronic or a paper application, it still has to be processed by a human being at a secure terminal. So personnel and the technology are really important. And you got to have a place to put all those people and things. So space and working with the Department of Public Property is also an important part of this. Yeah. Space to program the machines, space to put all these terminals and equipment and personnel. Space to accommodate the COVID situation where we can't have everybody clustered together in one small room. So it's really clarity and resources for the technology, for the personnel, and the space to put that technology and personnel. Yeah.
So I know you've been watching with great interest the conversations in Harrisburg right now. There's a bill, I guess, that came out of the state government committee that proposes a number of things, a number of changes, but one important one is around the deadline for, I guess, requesting a vote by a mail ballot. It would move it up a week or back a week. It give people more time to request the application and then have it on its merry way. So is that critical in your wish list, or how do you feel about sort of the deadline changes?
A real frustration for me is that even though we were dealing with absentee ballots in the past, and we would have, let's say, 6,000 absentee ballots to process as opposed to 175,000, but still an issue. And I had talked to Jonathan Lai from the Philadelphia Inquirer about this, and he wrote some stories about it. Is there is no realistic way that if a voter applies the day of the deadline, and even though we're able to turn that application around in 24 hours and get it back in the mail, for that application or that ballot to go out to the voter, to be voted, and to come back to us in that narrow window is not realistic. And I appreciate the idea that you want to give people as much time to apply as possible. But there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is disenfranchising voters that are doing what they think they should do. If I apply by the deadline, it should go fine, right? I applied on the deadline, but realistically, with the turnaround in the Postal Service, it's not enough time for us to mail it out to you and for you to mail it back to us. So the only way to expand that, the only ways to expand that, are to make the deadline earlier or to push the deadline to receive the ballots back later, which is what the governor's executive order did at the last minute in this last primary, as long as it's postmarked on or before election day. So one or the other or both, something has to be done to fix the fact that voters are disenfranchised through no fault of their own by doing the things by the deadline, doing what they should do, doing what we're asking of them.
Well, and human nature, unfortunately, I think we all know that we tend to do things at the last minute. And that poses a problem here.
They do. And to use that kind of stupid terminology that I used before is like normal people are not necessarily focused on all this stuff 24/7. Yeah. Your mind tends to only focus on the election right before the election for a lot of people. They have lives, they have work, they have kids, they have, you know, people to take care of, they have friends, they have things going on in their lives other than just elections.
Hard to imagine, but
it was I didn't think of the examples to use, and when I was just saying all that, but you know, people do tend to focus at the last minute and pay attention to the last minute, and that's why we get crushed with voter registrations on the deadline. Yep. We get crushed with mail-in ballot applications on the deadline, is from people waiting until the last minute, or in some cases later.
So we have talked for about a half an hour. We've successfully avoided talking about the national political context. I don't think we can go too much longer. And this is, you know, I think you agree with me, given what you do. This is not we're not going to talk about this in partisan terms. You are a Republican. As you know, I have spent most of my life as a Republican. I'm an independent right now. I also saw you quoted, I was looking at an article when you ran for city controller, quoting the famous line, "There is no Republican nor Democratic way to fix potholes." And I think the same could be said of elections. It's a process, and we got to run the process as best we can, but it shouldn't be a political football. Having said that, here we are. We mentioned the lawsuit earlier. We'll suggest that maybe that has its own legal logic, but there clearly have been all kinds of conspiracy theories and allegations about the potential for fraud in vote by mail and voter registration databases in just about every aspect of the voting process that we know. That's only going to increase between now and November. It could be a cacophony of conspiracies. And you know, we'll keep Twitter busy. So the big question after that wind up is, how do you intend to react, respond, counter? How is Al Schmidt going to navigate those waters the next couple months?
Well, while we have that in every election, we have it certainly a lot more in presidential, national elections. I don't know if you remember in 2016, I was very outspoken about accusations related to elections in Philadelphia. I was not shy about that. Don't regret that for a second. I know that elections in Philadelphia are run with integrity. I know they are run in a bipartisan manner in terms of oversight and a nonpartisan manner in terms of what we do. And I know that we are staffed by a very dedicated group of people who are committed to making sure that every eligible voter can register to vote and every registered voter can vote on election day, and that those votes are counted expeditiously as possible and accurately. So whenever there are criticisms of any of those things, you know, it's when you're working with these people every day, it's hard to sometimes not take them personally. Like, you know how hard, I know how hard our staff works and how dedicated they are and how late at night they work and how committed they are to assisting any Philadelphian when it comes to voting. The one challenge is really sort of like not allowing yourself to react personally or emotionally toward criticisms that come your way. There is a very big disconnect out there that's probably even wider than before between the ends of the political spectrum when it comes to voting. Like, we saw more than 50% of Democrats who voted vote by mail. We saw about 30% of Republicans vote by mail.
Statewide, you're talking about?
I'm sorry?
In the city or statewide?
In the city.
Yeah.
So there was definitely a distrust among a lot of Republicans when it comes to voting by mail. So when a story happens or sort of comes about in a different state related to a totally different vote by mail system, I see it all over social media, and a lot of it comes, directed by my way. Voting by mail was passed by a Republican House in Harrisburg. It was passed by a Republican Senate in Harrisburg and signed by a Democratic governor. That election reform package was a bipartisan, voted by Republicans and Democrats in Harrisburg, who wrote those laws. So vote by mail, is an example of almost like a disconnect between a lot of Republicans and a lot of Democrats that we see. So we have to do whatever we can to address concerns about whether it's in-person voting or voting by mail. So we address on our Twitter or our Facebook account, but usually Twitter is where we receive most of these things, where someone says, I got a notification that my ballot wasn't counted. So we'll track that ballot down and we'll respond back publicly. Ballot wasn't counted because it was postmarked on June 8th. That's not possible. I sent it 2 weeks before Election Day. But I don't think people know what we see. We'll see, well, that voter dated it June 6th, where they signed the voter declaration.
Right.
And it's postmarked June 8th. They definitely didn't mail it 2 weeks before and, post-date it for a day after Election Day. So we try to provide responses as best we can through social media when these things come up. And we do everything we can to dig through tens of thousands, or depending on how they're organized, 175,000 pieces of paper to track down and address individual voters' concerns. And part of that is to try to, add some clarity to this and get rid of some of the mystery and some of the conspiracies that you might hear. But what I do know is that someone will tweet something with a complaint that is unfounded, and it'll be retweeted 45 times before we respond back in 3 hours.
Yeah.
And even though we respond back, hey, it's postmarked June 8th, it'll still get retweeted another sort of 50 times. So it's a little bit frustrating, not only to kind of play whack-a-mole, but also to kind of keep up with how quickly information travels, especially when it's untrue.
Yeah. The truth is much less interesting than these flights of fancy. Let's. I know you've got other things on your plate today, so let's wrap up in a couple minutes. But I wanted to ask you sort of, again, this is probably a very GAO type question. Transport you back. It's, pick a date after the election, November 5th, November 10th. What would you like to be able to say about how this election was run, that told you and gave you the ability to tell others that it was a success? What does success look like, as the consultants say?
Success is meeting benchmarks and deadlines. Success is making sure that every application for a mail-in vote, for example, that you receive is processed and mailed out before the deadline and in a reasonable turnaround time. And we were able to do that in the primary. Success is making sure that anyone who chooses to vote in person is able to go to a polling place. That polling place is accessible, and that polling place is staffed by people to run it on election day, which we were also able to do in the primary. Doesn't mean that when you're dealing with more than 1,700 precincts or divisions, they're called in Philadelphia, they're called precincts in the rest of the world, in the city, it doesn't mean that everyone opens at exactly 7 o'clock. A janitor may not show up to unlock the door by 6 a.m. when they should. There might be a construction site occurring, in the street outside. A place could get flooded the night before. A crime scene, every conceivable thing that you could possibly imagine happens in a city of this size and lead up to election day. So, but making sure that all those polling places are equipped and staffed adequately is another important measure of success. Basically, if you register to vote, can you vote on election day or vote by mail in advance? And to make sure that voters aren't disenfranchised by anyone or disenfranchised by the process.
Great. I think that we were doing this. I know you did. We just received and have compiled the responses to the voter experience survey that we did in the spring, and have about 3,000 responses, and we'll be glad to share those with you and your staff.
Yeah, we always review those. It's a great resource for us.
Because I always remember back when I was at Penn, the professors would say, the plural of data is not anecdote. So a little bit of data, I hope, will be helpful. But thanks to you, Al, for joining us. And as I've said to you privately and said publicly, we're ready to do everything we can to make this election something that Philadelphia can be proud of. And it's core to our mission. And so we look forward to working with you. Happy to take the Volkswagen for a few more spins if that's helpful.
We'll work for that.
But I'm sure we'll be talking, but thanks again for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, David.